Imagine holding your newborn, warm and impossibly small, his breath a quick tide against your chest, the salty, sweet smell of new life filling the room. You name him João. 5 days pass like a single bright strand of thread, and then hands you do not know tear him away as if he were a ledger, a thing to be recorded and sold. Unveiling the tragedy, how the colonel lost his vision in Bahia's darkest hour. The year is 1839. The place, São José, a sugar and tobacco estate in the Recôncavo Baiano, near Cachoeira. The land is a carved landscape of cane rows and slave quarters, canzaves and a senzala, where labor organizes life and life itself can be accounted for in bodies and pesos. At the estate's center stands Colonel Manuel Vieira de Souza, prosperous, feared, accustomed to having his will run through men and women like a forced current. He keeps a locked box of rapé, powdered tobacco snuff, and prides himself on the habit more than most keep a jewel. He sells the light-skinned infants born on his soil. Some he fathered, others are merely convenient capital. The sale of a newborn is a transaction as ordinary there as the harvest. Quiteria was born into that pattern. She arrived on São José's ground with a name not of her choosing, learned the rhythms of toil before she learned that the world could be different. The field shaped her hands, the senzala shaped her silence. Still, inside the silence she carried whole other things. A memory of her mother's voice, the furtive comforts shared with other women as they mended wounds and braided hair. Small rebellions passed between the hands of the enslaved. When she became a mother, those quiet things focused and hardened. João was not only a child, he was tether, proof, a living answer to the things taken from her. On the 5th morning after João's birth, the capataz, an enforcer of the colonel's will, came with the whip and a paper order. Accounts say he walked into the hut with the same absence of ceremony with which he might have entered a warehouse. He lifted João with gloved hands. Quiteria screamed. Others say the sound was animal, a breaking of bone from the inside. The capataz slapped her, or somewhere nearby the lash cracked, and with the infant gone she had nothing to hold but an absence that filled the room like smoke. The colonel's profit, his claim on bodies, had been established again. Grief does not always erupt openly. For Quiteria, it folded inward and became strategy. She learned a different language, patience. She stopped crying in the open. She watched the colonel as if she were learning the way a clock moves. She listened to the low, intimate rituals that sustained him, the small comforts that marked his day as sovereign. To understand what came after, one must know about rapé and about the strange economies of desire on plantations like São José. Rapé, powdered tobacco often inhaled through the nostrils, had a ceremonial and private life among men of means in the 19th century. At São José, the colonel's rapé box was a talisman. He carried it with him, opening it at the table, in private rooms, at night. Mixed into the snuff at times was calvergem, quicklime, used by some to make the effect sharper. The use of such substances was more common than we might suppose, and it was also secret, buried in the household's intimacies. Quiteria watched these intimacies from the edge, at the kitchen's fire, carrying water from the well, or at night when household servants tidied the colonel's study. She observed the way he handled his box, the sequence of his gestures when he reached for the snuff. She observed the lock on the box, and the habit of the men who brought it to his hand. For months, she performed the quiet work of a spy without news, collecting small grains of lime here or there, learning the rhythm of the household, and listening, always listening, for the moment the colonel's attention would drift. These months of watching are hard to dramatize without stealing from what they were. Slow, interior, full of small reckonings. Surrounding Quiteria were other women who worked the fields and the kitchens, women who bore witness. They mended each other's clothes, exchanged sharp looks when the colonel's tastes flared into abuse, and offered crumbs of comfort when they could. In the privacy of their whispered circles, stories circulated, tales of sold children, of men's appetites, of the unfair calculations that made family into commodity. It was common knowledge that the colonel enriched himself by selling infants who showed lighter skin. For crying mothers there was no recourse under the law. Their bodies were property, and grief alone could not buy a child back. She learned, not in a single instant, but as a steady accrual, how the colonel drank himself into loosening his vigilance. There were harvest fetes, nights when harvesters danced, when casks were emptied, and when the great house filled with music that smoothed the edges of cruelty. On one such night, a harvest celebration, tradition remembers, he drank more than usual. The household's defenses thinned. The capataz staggered. Guards slept. People who had always walked in and out of the rooms found their steps heavy. It was then that Quiteria saw an opportunity in the loosened tides. The execution of her plan, as tradition tells it, was not the dramatic climax of a folk tale, but the culmination of all those narrow days. She moved through shadowed corridors, not as the heroine of a play, but as a woman who had been measured by loss. Accounts say she entered the room where the colonel kept his things and, without describing the technicalities, took the repas box and swapped its contents with a mixture she had prepared from the materials she'd gathered. There is no need to describe methods or recipes here. The act itself is what holds moral weight. She returned it as it had been, closed and smelling of familiarity, a punishment cloaked as care. Morning braided into chaos. The colonel, reaching for the rapé as he always did, brought it to his face and inhaled. What followed unfolded like a nightmare for a household that had grown used to his invulnerability. His eyes burned, he flailed, he could not see. The sound of men running, the clatter of chairs, the sharpness of commands turned muffled. Someone fetched the physician. The physician examined the colonel, and with an authority that confirmed what everyone knew would happen in such a fragile body, pronounced the damage irreversible. Vision lost. The diagnosis became the event that unmasked more than a physical calamity. It revealed for everyone the thin thread by which these people's power had hung. What the colonel had thought of as invulnerability was, in truth, a fragile arrogance. The household that had moved at his whim now moved around a man reduced to dependence. He became a man guided by other people's hands, listening for the footfalls he could no longer see. Quiteria's position after the act was not triumphant fireworks. There was no public exultation. There was only the complex aftermath of a single, decisive choice. She returned to work under the eyes of others. She bore the same marks of labor. She washed the same pots and carried the same water. But inside, accounts hold. She felt an unusual steadiness, an armor forged in the knowledge that she had exacted a price for João. She did not dance with satisfaction. She did not become a legend overnight. She carried both the weight of what she had done and the ache that had driven her to it. The colonel's decline was not simply physical. Rumors passed through neighboring fazendas, plantations. Some landowners, hearing the tale and fearing contagion of retribution, altered their behavior. They began to keep their valuables more private, to suspect those they had never suspected, and to restrain certain predations that had been both private and commonplace. The story, told tensely by candlelight in kitchens and under trees, became a kind of cautionary tale. A reminder that absolute power has vulnerabilities, and that the same gaze that takes can be startled into blindness. There is a moral ambiguity that must be held carefully. Quiteria's act was revenge. It was also an assertion of agency in a system that allowed none. The narrative that rose around the event has sometimes cast her as a kind of avenging mother, a force of nature who corrected balance with a personal accounting. But the deeper truth, messier and truer, is that her decision emerged from a context where law and human decency had failed her. There was no just court to hear a mother's plea. The only justice available to her was an intimate, dangerous kind. That reality doesn't resolve the ethical tension. It places it in starker relief. What followed in the larger society was not a tidy, moralistic resolution. The colonel did not die immediately, nor did he disappear. He lived years haunted by the darkness he carried. His household whispered about his mistaken confidence. He became more cautious with his appetites, less publicly brazen. Some accounts suggest that sales of infants slowed, at least in the immediate vicinity. Others contend that the economic engines of slavery remained unmoved. Memory, however, functioned differently from law. Stories of Quiteria and the blinded colonel spread beyond São José. The tale was told and retold. There are points where oral history softens edges and adds invention, but the colonel remained. A mother had paid back theft with a price that could be counted in sight. Quiteria's later years are as shadowed as much of her earlier life. Records do not offer a portrait of a woman transformed into celebrity or martyr. She lived among people who had watched her take a risk, and who afterward watched her with a mixture of awe and apprehension. Some sought her counsel, others kept distance. She aged with the marks of labor and with the complicated peace that revenge sometimes yields. Not everyone agreed with her choice. Some condemned it as a crime, as further violence. Others hailed it as necessary resistance. For descendants and neighbors, the story entered the air as a lesson and as a wound, an emblem of the terrible options slavery imposed. The physician's verdict, the clinical phrase irreversible blindness, is a blunt act of closure within the narrative. It gives form to the colonel's vulnerability, but it does not make the moment simple. There was no divine reckoning announced, no mirage of easy restoration. What people felt, watching the colonel stumble through rooms, was a complicated satisfaction braided with sorrow. The satisfaction was particular. A man who had exercised ownership over bodies had had his own body returned to dependence. The sorrow was universal. A child had been sold, a mother had been robbed. A system remained intact enough that acts like Quiteria's were conceivable at all. Over time, the event took on the qualities of legend. It traveled from mouth to mouth, embroidered by those who felt the need to underline different morals. For some, it stood as a warning to men who would take what was not theirs. For others, it became a hymn to maternal resistance, the story told to children so they would understand the fierce calculus of survival. The blindness in the tale became a metaphor. Not only did the colonel lose his sight, but his class lost its moral vision. Men who thought themselves above the consequences began to imagine the possibility of retribution. That imagination, more than the physical harm inflicted, altered behavior in ways law could not. Yet the legend also does something else. It forces us to confront how ordinary cruelty makes extraordinary acts possible. The sale of children, the casual appropriation of bodies, the sexual exploitation of women. These are not remote horrors but the daily logic of a system. The story of Quiteria and João reveals that the violence of everyday life under slavery composes a landscape where desperate choices will be made. When we speak of retribution, then, we must hold both the subject and the object, the avenger and the oppressed, within the same frame of sorrow. There are further ironies and human details that linger. The colonel's blindness did not, for example, erase his wealth in a single moment. He kept land, men still worked for his account, and transactions continued. But the rhythm of his commands changed. He was no longer the man who looked and ordered. He became the man who listened and suspected. The fear that settled in him, fear of being seen, fear of being thwarted, was a different currency from the one he had once traded in. For the people on São José, that fear was itself a small redistribution of power, an intangible shift that altered daily operations and private behaviors. And Quiteria, what did the act give back to her? It did not resurrect João. No action could. It did not annul the trauma of being a mother who had been made to watch her child walk away into someone else's ledger. If legend offers a tidy moral, real life refuses it. She carried on with work, with the chores and the woven rituals of the enslaved community. She held her head in a new way, perhaps, and wherever she walked, the tale shadowed her steps. People saw her differently, some with reverence, some with suspicion. That complexity is essential. Heroic labels flatten the difficult terrain of moral imagination. Quiteria's story asks us to hold the ache and the assertion together. In the end, the tragedy we unveil is not simply the colonel's lost sight. The event is a prism through which we see the larger moral blinding that slavery enforced. A system that made human beings legible only as capital, whose laws and practices encouraged intimate violations, whose quotidian cruelties pushed intelligence and feeling to the edge. The Colonel's physical darkness became a mirror reflecting a wider moral darkness. For the plantation, and for the neighboring fazendas, the episode functioned as revelation. One action, violent, private, and fraught, exposed the brittle underbelly of a social order. As years passed, the story of São José entered local memory. Children learned it in a handful of different forms. Elders told it with the cadence of caution and pride. When descendants recall annexed names and stolen childhoods, they sometimes return to this tale as a way to name resistance. Not tidy freedom, but stubborn refusal. The story continues to trouble us because it refuses to settle into a single moral posture. It asks uncomfortable questions. What do we do when the law is the instrument of harm? When there is no avenue for redress, what forms of justice remain? Can revenge be understood as a claim on personhood rather than an embrace of violence as virtue? If you have been gripped by this account, if the image of that 5-day-old child and the woman who named him lingers in your mind, stay with it. And if you want to see more of these stories from the hidden corners of history, subscribe to follow the full account and the histories behind it. The final image is quiet. Quiteria's hands, calloused by labor, folding and unfolding a piece of cloth. The Colonel, led by a servant, feeling the table's edge. The fields continuing their cycles, indifferent to individual sorrow. The narrative leaves the Colonel blind, yes, but it also leaves him emblematic, an example of a social blindness that permitted atrocities and made vengeance an option that some felt obliged to claim. This is not a paean to vigilante acts. It is, instead, an invitation to witness. The story of São José asks us to look at the mechanisms that made such an episode possible, to honor the grief that birthed Quiteria's resolve, and to hold the moral complexity of her choice. It is a tale of sorrow and of righteous indignation braided together, of a mother's loss and a community's trembling recalibration in the face of a man who could no longer see. Share your reaction in one word in the comments: justice or darkness, memory or grief. And if you want more hidden histories from Bahia and beyond, like and subscribe.